All right, now that we have a lot of the basics down and we're really comfortable moving our tools around and handling them and holding them properly, and you've had a chance to practice that to the point where it feels like second nature, the best thing to do next is what you would do next in real life. So you're at the operating table, you want to help suturing, you grab your tools. The next thing that you'll probably do is you'll have to load the needle driver. Now, sometimes the scrub tech may hand you it loaded, but you want to be prepared for being able to load your own needle driver for a number of reasons. Number one, you may not have someone hand it to you, and number two, someone who hands it to you may not have loaded it properly. So this is where everything kind of comes together. And again, so we're going to hold our tools, and I'm going to go without the loops because this is the way that I hold my needle drivers. And here we kind of have our Addison forceps, and this is where knowing where the double notched side is so important. Because let's say that this isn't loaded and you have to pick this up off the ground, you can kind of see how I have it wedged right in between those teeth, and it's actually pretty secure here and it won't fall out easily. So I have a lot of control over the needle, it's not going to slip, and now I'm free to load it into my driver. Now again, you really want to be mindful of a few things when you're loading your needle driver that perhaps people don't really talk about too much because they are very basic, but I would argue they're very, very important. As you look at your needle, you're going to have a lot of different types that you're loading, but they're all going to more or less be in this curved pattern. You are free to load the needle anywhere on this curved pattern. And there's benefits and obstacles that occur with your positioning depending on where you choose to load it. Now, just to start, we're just going to load it in the middle, just for simplicity's sake. And basically all you do is you hold it with your forceps in your offhand, you open it up, the needle driver in the way that we discussed, and you just load it at the tip, like so, and then you lock it into place. Now, it's very important that you put it on the tip of the needle driver just because you don't want to necessarily have to put your needle driver too deep into any tissues or structures. You want the needle to be on the end just so it's as easy to use as possible. And here is where we see the advantage of not having to have your fingers in the loop, where you can kind of rotate this around in any direction that you want, and you're free to kind of do that just because you're not stuck in these loops. Now, the important thing to keep in mind is that I've loaded it in the middle, but you also have the choice of manipulating how you load the needle. This will become more obvious as to why it's important, but I think it's important in your training now to just be very, very aware of your different options. Now, if you wanted to, you could load the needle further back here, for example. Oops. And if you were to do this, now what you can see is that you can actually take what's called a bigger bite. You have more area of the needle that you can thread through a structure. So what this means is that you can kind of transverse a larger area, you can go through more tissue, i.e. the bigger bite. But the other thing to keep in mind is that you may have to curl your hand back a lot more to make sure that the needle enters in the right orientation. So just keep in mind that depending on where you choose to load the needle will kind of dictate how much tissue you can drive the needle through, and also where the needle has to be oriented in order to take the initial bite. Also, in addition to kind of choosing where on the needle you want to kind of load, you can also skew the angle. You don't have to make it perpendicular. You can actually skew it in this direction if you wanted to, or in the opposite direction. And it all depends on what you're suturing and the angle of what you're suturing. Sometimes it's advantageous to have the needle pointing away from you because of the orientation of what you're trying to do. Sometimes it's advantageous to have it pointing towards you because you're suturing towards yourself in an odd angle. The whole point is that you want to be comfortable loading the needle any way that you want. So when you're practicing, I encourage you to get very, very good at picking up the needle from, let's say, an operating surface, because that's what you're going to have to do in real life, and get comfortable picking it up with your forceps, kind of wedging it in between the teeth here like we discussed, and also get really, really comfortable picking it up with your needle drivers as well. And you can use both and manipulate them between the two to get the orientation that you want. And as you start getting more and more comfortable, you can practice loading the needle, further back so you can take bigger bites, loading it more closely so you can take smaller bites, and then angling it away from you, towards you, and of course perpendicular. The first one to focus on perhaps is making it perpendicular and loading it in the middle of the needle, but ultimately the more you can do, you'll find yourself in situations where really what you're suturing isn't in an optimal position, and you'll be better equipped to handle what you're doing because you can load the needle in whatever way that you want, and you'll be prepared. So that's the important thing in thinking about loading the needle.